My name is Scott Hinkle. I'm Legislative Director to Congressman Juan Vargas. And first off, let me thank the RDLA and the Congressional Rare Disease Caucus for having us here today. And I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what Tracy, I think, was trying to get at, which is how do we foster innovation? How do we grow it? And more specifically, how do we get at it from the financing side? And I'm here to talk about, there we go, HR 3731, the Rare Disease Fund, or RAD Fund Act, as we like to call it. And before I dive into the details of it, I want to talk to you about something that's seemingly unrelated, but is relatively relevant, which is movies. Who here, show of hands, saw the most recent Star Wars film in the theaters? Show of hands, anybody? Okay. Most of the folks in the room. And how many people saw it twice? If you're a big dork like me? Okay. How many of you guys saw, nope, no way. There we go. How many of you saw Tomorrowland in the theaters? So basically nobody. So imagine for a second that you're a movie studio executive and you're sitting in your office trying to figure out, how do I fund movies? How do I choose which ones are going to be accessible, which ones are not going to be? And I have to decide very early on, because I got to line up millions of dollars in funding in order to make this happen. Well, you might sit there and you may want Star Wars, third highest grossing film of all time, but sometimes you might get Tomorrowland, one of the top 20 biggest flops of all time. So let's take a look and see how the industry does as a whole. So if you look at 2015, these are the top 10 most anticipated films. Excuse me. And if you look at the next ones, these are the top 10 highest grossing films. Well, there's some overlap, but a lot of things aren't on there anymore. And some, like Tomorrowland, actually fell off the list. Now you might be looking at it going, oh, okay, well, Tomorrowland, that made sense. No, that wasn't a good concept. The last time Disney made a theme park inspired movie, it was Pirates of the Caribbean and made multi-billion dollars. So you might sit there and go, okay, good director, George Clooney, maybe something that looks good on paper doesn't necessarily turn out. So when moving forward, right, you kind of sit there and you think, okay, well, the movie industry is still around, so they must have changed something, right? They used to fund them as one-offs. So instead, they switched to something called slate financing. So instead of trying to convince investors to invest in one picture at a time, instead they go, hey, why don't you guys fund 5, 6 of them, a dozen of them, our entire slate at a time, which lowers the risk by diversifying the portfolio. And then you don't necessarily have to worry about things failing. The top 3 films all made a ton of money. The bottom 2, Pan, Jupiter Ascending, they all bombed. But because the top ones made money, they returned money to their investors and were able to do it. Now, you guys may be sitting here and going, okay, this is great. What does life sciences have to do with movie financing? Well, right now, life sciences is, for the most part, funded by venture capital in a one-off fashion. You find a compound, you put investors in it, and you hopefully build a company around it. Hopefully it goes on to make $1 billion. But a lot of times it doesn't. And that leads to, as Tracy mentioned, the valley of death, where it's very, very hard to get funding. It's basically a funding gap between the end of preclinical research and the end of FDA phase 2 trials. Now, the industry currently relies on venture capital. Anybody know what the venture capital market is in the US about? About $175 to $250 billion. It's a decent amount of money. Anybody know what the US Treasury bond market is? About $38 trillion with a T. Orders of magnitude more money. By the movie industry switching to slate financing, they were able to tap the US bond market. So basically we're sitting here going, why don't we do that in life sciences? Why don't we do the same thing? Well, what would that look like? So instead of asking investors to invest in a single compound, why don't we build a diversified portfolio? And why don't we call it, for instance, the RAD Fund? And we'll go ahead and ask them to, put equity into it, but maybe we can also issue some bonds. Let's say 50% guaranteed, government bonds, 50% debt. Now, some of those compounds are going to fail, but maybe 1, 2 get through, and all of a sudden you make a profit, and you can pay back all your investors. That's really, at the end of the day, what the RAD Fund is about. So our bill creates a $400 million pilot project, $200 million in government-backed senior debt, $200 million in equity, and basically finances only early-stage rare disease therapeutics. End of preclinical through the end of FDA phase 2, you have to sell them off at phase 3. And it leverages the scientific expertise at NIH, and the government guarantees the bonds. This is based on research that has come out of MIT. Some of you may have seen it before, Dr. Lowe, Dr. Stein. And basically they show that if you were to put together a fund of $400 million with 10 to 20 compounds, investors make their money back 99.8% of the time. As a result, you can, instead of just tapping the venture capital market, you can tap the bond market and pour a lot more money into research, which hopefully develops a lot more drugs, which hopefully means a lot more patients get treated. So the idea, more money in this scenario, good. I'd like to go ahead and thank Dr. Stein, Dr. Lowe, Jose Maria Fernandez for MIT for their pioneering research on this, and I'm happy to take questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.